Hello everyone and welcome to the Unity 101 Fundamentals class brought to you by 3dbuzz.com. Tonight your lead instructor will be Mr. Nelson LeKay. Hey Nelson.
Hey.
Joining with some of the lecture tonight will be Gavin. Gavin Whitlock. Hey Gavin. How's it going, man?
I'm good, yes.
Right, fantastic. And myself, Jason Busby, sitting here just to give these two guys as much trouble as I possibly can. Now, we're going to be picking up, this is our second week in the Unity 101 class, and things are going to heat up tonight. Now, last week at the end of the class, one of the things I had stressed, and I also stressed it at the beginning of class, was that for those of you that had not ever played with Unity before, I had put the link in BuzzNet and explained that there were a lot of videos, a lot of fundamental videos that we have done at 3D Buzz. We've made freely available. You can download and watch them over and over and over. And I made it very clear that I wanted you guys to do that. It's very important because even though this is a Fundamentals 101 class, I thought it would be counterproductive for us to just rehash that material. What fun is that? We want to go forward. So that material's already there, and you guys are always welcome to ask us questions about stuff that you saw in that material. So we are going forward. I also asked for those of you that have no prior coding experience to please take a look at some of our C# videos. We've already done C# 101. We taught 2 of those. We've done 2 C# 102s, and now we're in the middle of, it was only 1 102, wasn't it? Yeah, I think so. And now we're on C# 103. There's lots of content out there that you guys can watch, all freely available. So tonight we are going to be getting into a lot of coding. Now tonight is going to be broken up into, I just saw something over in BuzzNet, not using JavaScript for the code. Oh, heavens no. And that's not a sad face thing. If you're wanting to be a serious game developer, that's a good thing. It will actually expand what you're able to do considerably. So,
well, this goes back to what I mentioned last week. To all of you who are looking for the Make Game button, and you know that if you pay a certain amount of money, we will tell you which hidden menu it's in. It doesn't work like that. The thing is, Unity does so much for you. It can present itself, and obviously they wish to get as many people using it as possible. But the same goes for all game engines. They present themselves as being able to do it all for you. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen advertisements in the music world for similar things. You can now write music without needing to understand music. Well, yeah, you can, but it will be very poor. It's inherent part of making a game that in order to do a specific thing, you can't expect there to be something pre-done for you. You're going to have to make it yourself. And basically that means that you are going to have to be able to comprehend at least the most fundamental general principles of programming, such as, ifs and whiles and fors and creating and instantiating objects, just because otherwise you're going to be left with cubes moving around and bumping into spheres.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Gavin, what I'd like for you to do, Nelson, let's just take a minute for this, and let's address why C# over JavaScript, because we've got new people that are in the class that have joined us ever since last night when we were talking about it in the after hours after the Photoshop class was over. So why C#? Why not just use JavaScript, since that's kind of how things defaulted with Unity to begin with?
Well, there's quite a few reasons for that. The biggest reason is that there's a lot of existing C# codes and C# libraries that you can take advantage of within your program. That's not the same for JavaScript, and I know nobody can actually see me right now, but I'm finger quoting, because the JavaScript language in Unity isn't going to be the JavaScript that you are familiar with in web development. It's not really the same language, even though it's based off the same specification. And even more than that, I typically do not trust that implementation of that particular language on Unity, because that's very Unity specific. Not only did these developers create this language and this platform, this runtime for this language, just for Unity, by doing that, they locked out the ability to interop with other things that you might want to be able to interop with, and you do not get this same sort of tooling support that's available in C#. Now, the C# language is very well defined. It's very well evolved by Microsoft, and the Mono team has been very good at creating very powerful compilers that follow the C# specification and compile very nice optimized code. And not only that, because C# is such a large language, you also have tools like Visual Studio and ReSharper and just other things that you wouldn't have in a language that is built specifically for one purpose. So there's really, I don't feel, as a programmer who knows both JavaScript and C#, I feel no need to ever write anything in JavaScript for Unity. I understand that it might be a little less intimidating for people, but really not by much.
Agreed.
And I mean, for those of you who are, I would imagine that most of you who are concerned about the idea of using C# rather than JavaScript have sort of come to JavaScript because of Unity, or in that it's a very similar paradigm to programming in C#. They're both curly brace languages for a start, thank the Lord. Oh, I hate Python. And I love Python, but I hate Python. But yeah, Nelson, can you expand more specifically on what I'm trying to say?
Well, I mean...
No, go ahead.
The JavaScript code and C# code will look similar, I suppose you could say. JavaScript code will have less noise because some things are implied, such as the class definitions and stuff like that. But overall, there's not that big of a jump between the two languages. The only
now,
difference
there are some questions. Go ahead and finish that one off.
And of course, like I said earlier, you won't have the same tooling support for JavaScript or Unity script, which
and that's huge.
It should be called, not JavaScript. It doesn't have quite the same tooling support.
Yeah, and that's huge. For those of you that are joining, I had mentioned last week about ReSharper, and now, of course, we've got some new students that are in tonight. ReSharper is an incredible extension for Visual Studio by JetBrains that it's like having an expert programmer kind of sitting right beside you, kind of pointing things out and helping you along. It's worth every penny. But we're working with JetBrains, and one of the cool things that they've done for us is allowed us to give away free license. They're limited to a year, and we're already into that year. So it's what, probably 8 months, 7 months.
I think it's around about the end of April.
But so far they've renewed once, which means they're going to. I'm quite confident they're going to renew for a third time, which means we just pass out a new code and keep on going. So all you need to do is get a hold of Zach, just PM Zach, and say, hey, Jason told me to PM you. I'm in the Unity class, and I need to get the code for ReSharper. Nelson will be using it as we work our way through the code. And from time to time, Nelson will be pointing out, oh, and this is useful because of ReSharper, and this is useful because of ReSharper. It's worth it, man. It's worth double the price easily. So I just wanted to point that out. Again, for those of you that are new, make sure you contact Zach if you're interested in getting ReSharper, and he'll give you a license for it. Now, we had another question come in that, Nelson, you might find is an interesting one. It says, is it okay to mix languages? Or would it be better to take pre-existing open JavaScript code out there and remaking it in C#?
I would highly discourage mixing languages. I just would. Because at the point where I've never done it, but I know for a fact that if you have JavaScript code, it is not going to interop with C#. Now, well, as far as the tooling is concerned, I do not
Correct.
know if it interops with C# if during runtime.
I mean, if you can have JavaScript scripts on one object and C# scripts on another object. And
then most importantly, having the C# scripts access properties of the JavaScript scripts.
Yeah.
That might work during runtime. I've never tried it, but the tooling support I know for a fact wouldn't. I would highly advise against mixing languages. As far as take pre-existing open JavaScript code out there and remaking in C#, that's really not as hard as it sounds. If you know C# and you know JavaScript or Unity script, you should be able to do that fairly easily, because at that point you're really just factoring out the actual algorithm of whatever it is you're trying to do. And when you're working with two different languages that support the same sort of curly brace syntax, is, based off C, then that should be a non-trivial or a trivial exercise.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, you can't literally, but you can almost go line by line, and it's just a question of changing out the keywords to match the other language. It's one of those processes that is very straightforward once you get into the swing of it. And actually, from a didactic point of view, I've found it to be a very good way, once you know programming with one language, to get another language quick, sort of a rough outline of it, is to try and transfer code just like that. I did it with C++ into C#, transferring code over, because it gets you an idea of how both languages deal with the same problem in slightly different ways. But I'm probably getting a bit off track.
Yeah. So to go into tonight, we've got a lot of stuff that we're going to be doing. As I pointed out last week, I know that we've got people in the class that are new to programming, and please do your best to follow along. Remember, we're also available for questions, PM questions to Nelson, to Gavin. Kind of the order is Gavin first, then Nelson, then myself, based off of how busy we are and how quickly we can get back to you.
If you have programming questions, sorry, seeing as you put me first on that list, but if you have programming questions, please start a thread in the C# or Unity, probably the C# forums if it's a programming question. If it's more about the way Unity, if you're struggling with adding components in Unity or something like that, in the Unity forums. Because even if I check my PMs a couple of times a day, there's no guarantee I'm going to know the answer. And you're more likely to get a quicker response if you make your question available to, the hundreds of people we have coming through the site.
Agreed. Absolutely. Also, real fast, for those of you that are new into doing one of our member sponsor courses and you're in the webinar right now, we've got 3 people in the webinar that are not in BuzzNet. Please make sure that you open a browser and point your browser over to buzznet.3dbuzz.com. This is extremely important. One, you'll end up getting kicked out of the class if you don't. 2, it's how we're able to make sure that we record all of the interaction and attendance and all of that stuff. Otherwise, it would just be a complete nightmare. So again, please make sure that you point your browser over to buzznet.3dbuzz.com and then log in with your regular 3dbuzz credentials. This is very important. All right, we're down to just 2 people, so 2 of you guys need to get that done. All right, so tonight, big night planned. Nelson, you want to bring over the kind of the outline?
Well, typically I don't show notes.
We tend to keep that hidden so that we
people
can
are
stop at any moment.
I know, but I'm going to show how it's
You've
broke
already
up.
explained how that we might be stopping.
So see, we've got a busy night ahead of us. And we've divided things up into passes. You can kind of think of them as modules. And if it looks like it's going to just become an insanely crazy night helping people get through code and getting things working, we'll simply divide this up into 2 weeks and we'll add 1 more week to the course. There's a lot of content in this Unity 101 class that I want you guys introduced to. This is important to me. There's a specific place that I would like for you to be at by the end of the 101 class. So we'll just do what we need to do. But you can see that we've got things divided up into these 5 passes, and so if we get only through 3 passes or 4 passes, just know we will pick back up next week if need be. Okay?
And there is a kind of...
Go ahead.
Well, there's one last thing I wanted to add on that to it, which is that because of how much is done for you by Unity, the actual things that we're getting into here in what is still a 101 course may well seem more complex ideas, because the sort of things that we dealt with in the 101 for C# are literally on the basis of how do you even display something on the screen.
Exactly.
Those sorts of things actually Unity does for you. That's one of the great joys of Unity. So like here, first pass, the big chunk, and probably quite a chunk of this lesson will be given over to the game state, because we are going to be setting up a very basic state system for our game, which will lead us through. It will give us the outline of loading screens and you died, you didn't die, and you are in the process of dying, i.e. you're playing the game.
Yeah.
But, and I just wanted to point that out because that is something to be, that was basically the C# 102 course.
Yeah.
And that's the first part of this lesson today.
And we'll be reusing some of the graphics that were done previously until I can get Zach long enough to make us some new ones. It's just Zach's been completely swamped building lesson plans and teaching classes recently. Today's, many of you know that he's got 2 classes back to back with Maya 101 and Blender 102, so quite busy. But anyways, so Nelson, what are we going to do tonight? What's the goal? I mean, we're seeing this roadmap right here, but kind of talk about it.
Well, as we said originally in the course outline, we're going to be putting together a basic game. And by the end of today, I really want people and people who, for their homework, to have some basic sort of things put together for actually constructing the building blocks of the game we want to build. We want to talk about today we want to talk about, our state manager. How do we manage, different states between, start, win, playing, lose game, and so on. Then we want to talk about how we can tile a background, get the camera angled correctly. Then we're going to be talking about how we can get the player to move. And then we're going to be talking about how we can actually put other objects within the world that the player can collide with. And then at the end of this, we'll have a basic game that we can, jump through some hoops with, but that'll be the foundation for the rest of the classes.
Very cool. I did see a question come in asking what graphics will we use. If you've got the graphics from the 2D space shooter that we did previously, you can use those. This game's going to be more of a Zaxxon style game. If you remember back to those days, it's not going to be your 2D type shooter. It's going to be 3D. Oh, hey, all right, we've got some people that remember Zaxxon. Trust me, I spent many quarters keeping them in business for a while, playing the crap out of that game in arcades. That was good stuff. So I thought it would be really neat for us to make something like that. All right, so let's get started. We got stuff to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's not time for a break, Nelson. We can do this.
There were some questions, though. I don't know if you wanted me to focus
let's
on those
go ahead
immediately.
let's go ahead and knock those out real quick before we launch into a long lecture.
Yeah. All right. So from where is it better to begin to do a game? Making the code for animation, beginning for the world building, doing artificial intelligence to make the enemy shoot at you. What's the best way to begin? That's a very, very complicated question.
That's a whole course in itself, really.
It basically boils down to how do you approach basic software development. And you typically, approach software development in terms of, I guess you could say, features or iterations, where you work on an individual feature to get something on the screen working end to end as soon as possible, and then build on that. You wouldn't start with something like animation, not animation. You wouldn't start with something like AI, because what would you be applying your AI to? You wouldn't be applying your AI to anything that you could visibly see in the game. Now, when it comes to art assets such as animation, those can be certainly developed parallel to the development of the game by artists or yourself if you're the asset developer. So it's a really complicated question. There's no straightforward answer. My only advice would be try to organize the development of your game so that you have something on the screen as soon as possible, and then build on that. And don't be afraid to change code.
But this is, of course, what Nelson's saying is really sort of step 2 in and of itself, because step 1, and actually somebody's just pointed this out in BuzzNet, start on paper. What game do you want to make? Where you start in a game will differ depending on the sort of game you're making.
I certainly skipped over that part, but yes.
Yeah, just a bit. The actual, I'm going to make what game? Because all of a sudden, and this literally comes down to bullet points of it's going to be, I don't know, a shooter. And it's going to be in 3D, and it's going to be set in space, and you're going to die if you crash into things, and the win condition is to get to the end of the course. That is still far from detailed enough, in my opinion, in terms of your first thoughts. And then you go into each of those bullet points and start bulleting those out as well. How are you going to deal with each aspect of it? And this is before you even turn the computer on. Work out where you're going with things, and it will make your life easier in the long. Because otherwise, you'll get halfway into the project and come and reach a point where you go, if I'd done these 4 things a different way, I could do this now. Or what's I believe known as feature creep occurs, because you go off on tangents while you're coding otherwise. You go, it'd be cool if I just tweak this, I can do this as well. And then you end up with a game that has no focus and it bears no relation to what you were originally intending.
Mm-hmm. Okay, after Unity 101 and 102, can we follow along comfortably with the MMO content? I think the MMO content was, if you get through Unity 101 and get used to the editor and the features of Unity, I think that the MMO content, your ability to understand that, is going to be based off your ability to code and less about your knowledge of Unity, at least for the bits in the project that I worked on and the bits in the project that I saw was worked on before. There obviously is going to be a lot of considerations or things that you need to understand about Unity, but even those things were even cursory, overviewed.
Well, see, and the thing with it is that, because Palmy numbers just said the terrain R&D portion alone was mind-blowing. The thing is, none of the code, with the exception of some of the threading stuff, is particularly complicated in the MMO class. It's quite straightforward, and he explains what everything's doing. But by its very nature, things like the section on random noise generation and so forth, it's the maths behind the code that is what takes getting your head around. Similarly with the whole idea of procedurally making meshes and vertices and triangles and winding orders and that stuff. It's the algorithms that are more complicated to understand than the actual code. The code is very, very straightforward. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I do want to point something out real quick while you were about to, get started there, Nelson, and that is something that Nelson and I have talked about in the past, and I've pretty much decided on doing it. For those of you that have been following along with some of the MMO stuff, and you know that we've been really, really tight on time for being able to devote time to that. I think what we're going to do is just start a live class, and it'll just be an ongoing one. It won't have an end date. So for people that want to jump in and actually ask questions, like the next thing up that Nelson is going to be putting together is actually something really cool for Unity GUI stuff, CGS. And we've talked a lot about it, and there's been a lot of build-up to it with videos. But I think by actually having live classes over it as Nelson's, because some of this stuff gets complicated. This is not beginner stuff. It's not quite as easy as Gavin's making it out to sound, some of the later content. But I think it would be really nice having kind of an open forum, just like we have right now, for you guys to jump in and say, whoa, okay, Nelson, what you just did was like black voodoo. I'm lost. And then have Nelson help break it down. I think that would make the videos even more educational. And then for those of you, of course, that don't have the extra time to devote to doing something like that, not a problem. We'll be able to take those videos and just get them encoded and add them into the MMO system, and the MMO system will go forward. But I really like getting to interact with students, and I love when you guys ask questions. It just makes this content so much more valuable. You're still up for that, aren't you, Nelson?
Mm-hmm.
See, you're going to have to make those 18 certificate.
Make them what?
I said 18 certificate. If you think about somebody, do you not have that one in America? You're not going to... yes, I'm just thinking of some of the occasions when it won't do what you want it to.
Yeah.
The conversations we've had. Why won't it do what it wants?
Any thoughts on NGUI from the Unity store? And I have not actually been on the Unity store in a while, so I'm not familiar with NGUI. Okay, so with that, Nelson, let's go ahead and get things going.
Okay, so go ahead and hit participate if you guys are going to be following along with today's class. And don't hit ready because I haven't told you guys to do anything yet. Oh wow, we have quite a few people participating.
Well, our numbers have more than doubled since we started at 7:05.
All right, so the first step is going to be to launch Unity. Now, if you remember, the way I have my Unity installation configured, I get my project wizard every time I start it. For you guys, it might pop up your other or the last project you had open. If it did that, go ahead and go to File and Create New Project, and then select a folder.
And the way to get around that, if yours is configured to automatically open the last one, is as soon as you click on your taskbar to launch Unity, or the shortcut to launch Unity, hold down Alt while the splash screen appears, and it should bring up, if you do it quickly enough, it will bring up that window that was just there.
Every time I launch Unity, I prefer to have it like that, but some people don't, so that's a good compromise. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create a folder called Scenes, and I'm going to save the current scene as Scene 1. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called Code.
The next thing I normally do after creating that, did you actually save it, or did you just create? Wow, my mind's falling apart. I'll shut up.
Okay, so now that I have a code folder, this is the folder of my assets that I'm going to place all my code. Now, unlike last week, we are going to have quite a bit of classes that aren't actually mono behaviors. And I kind of want to point that out and just make it very clear that you are not tied to using mono behaviors exclusively for your code. And in fact, it becomes very useful to sort of abstract out of your mono behaviors so that your code can be written in a much cleaner way that isn't bogged down by the aspects of mono behaviors themselves and doesn't have the same limitations, such as not being able to use namespaces and stuff like that.
Well, you should probably mention about .NET versioning as well, just very briefly.
Well, in Unity, the compiler that it uses is a monocompiler, which supports C# 3 and the .NET 3.5 framework. I have suspicions that it actually does support C# 4, but doesn't have the correct runtime components to make it work based off some compiler errors that I saw. But the point is that any C# 3 code that you have should work just fine in Unity. And keep in mind, when I say C# 3, I'm referring to the C# version that was packaged with .NET 3.5, because all of the version numbers are out of sync and miserable and horrible to work with. Like, for example, C# 5 is going to be packaged with .NET 4.5, because that makes sense. So anything that should be compatible with C# 3, implicit typing, lambdas, generics obviously, because that's 2, and so on, will work just fine. Okay, so underneath code, I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called scripts, and this pains me to use this terminology, but I will use it for your guys' sake. Okay, so underneath this folder, I'm going to create a C# script. I'm going to call it Game Manager, and then we're going to be talking a little bit about Game Manager once Visual Studio opens up. So go ahead and get your code folder, your scripts folder, and your Game Manager script created. Fire up Visual Studio, wait a few years.
And then open it yourself, because it sometimes just refuses to open it.
Actually, I can...
The way because we did have a question about this from Carl. Yeah, the only way I found, and I searched quite widely on the web to get it to ignore mono, is to go and find monodevelop.exe and change the name of it so that it can't find it. Even then, it may well open it in something like Notepad++.
There's actually a better way.
Have you found something that works?
Yeah, well, it works the vast majority of the time. In fact, ever since I set this setting, it hasn't opened up mono behavior or mono develop or anything else. What I did was I went to File, or I went to Edit, Preferences, External Tools, and then I actually clicked on Browse, and I located my devenv.exe file, which, if you are not familiar with that, that's the Visual Studio executable. So that's going to be under C, or wherever you installed Visual Studio, Program Files x86, Microsoft Visual Studio 10, Common 7, IDE, and then devenv. And if you just click on open right there, ever since doing that, it hasn't opened it up in a different or improper editor. At least for me.
Nice.
Apparently somebody in the chat disagrees. But you saw how long it took to open up Visual Studio a second ago, and it still opened up in Visual Studio, so I don't know.
Cool.
Okay, so now that we're in Visual Studio, I nuked...
Did you address the, my apologies, did you address the Visual Studio Express with syncing?
I think I did last week. Where if you right-click and say Sync MonoDevelop Project, and then open up your Unity project in Windows Explorer, you'll be able to locate the CSproj and slins that you used to open it up. In fact, well, actually, there's two sets of CSprojes and slins. You'll want to grab the dash C# slin.
And yeah, I know that that you, and I'm also referring to Florum and Surreal as well. I know that you mentioned that last week. I just wanted to make sure Nelson mentioned it real quick now, because we do have several new people that have joined us today, just in case anyone's confused about getting into the project because they're using Express. Continue, sir.
Although honestly,
I will quickly bring up, Ryan said, you don't want me to open this in Mono. You're quite welcome to use Mono. But we won't
absolutely.
be. And we don't support Mono in terms of IDE questions.
terminology,
so-
you mean MonoDevelop. Sorry. Because of course we're using Mono, but it's MonoDevelop that we're
Yeah, sorry, the word is written in front of me, so I read what I saw. That's what he put. Yeah, MonoDevelop.
But yeah. We just won't support it, and you won't get ReSharper. In fact, I'm curious as to if you do what I just showed you guys with selecting the external editor, if you point it over to Express, I wonder if it'll just work. I've never tried that before because I've never really had it.
Unless they've changed something, it shouldn't.
All right. How to create the scene inside the folder. Basically, when you launch Unity, you will be given a blank scene that isn't saved. So if you just hit Control S for the first time, you'll get a save dialog that'll allow you to save your scene to any place into your assets folder.
The actual scene gets created the first time you save it. Basically, you don't ever create a scene.
Right, and as far as Unity, everything, there's no way to not be looking at a scene. You're always looking at a scene. It's just the default one isn't saved. I did not change my ReSharper inspection option. Oh, I kind of did. For those of you who have ReSharper and are sick of seeing blah, 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 those awful squigglies, go ahead, click on that, Alt-Enter, go down to Inspection Options for namespace does not correspond to file location, and change it to a hint. That'll make it less visually obnoxious. I get the namespace error with ReSharper. What can I do? That's not an error. It's a warning. It's simply saying that you are defying conventions of the language out of necessity because Unity can't support namespaces for some reason I'm not aware of. So you can just ignore it. Okay, so our game manager is going to be the primary mono behavior that will drive our state system. So let's go ahead and put together a state system really fast, implement it, and talk about what it does.
Yeah, who here has never heard the term, or come across the term state system before, or at least doesn't really get what we mean by it? So we have me, we have a square root for some reason, that's quite impressive.
It's a good place to start out. What the heck is it?
What's the ASCII code for that? I would check. No, that was a square root.
You mean UTF code? ASCII is no longer used.
It is in my head. Thank you, then. 251.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, because the code is so small, I just want to go ahead and get the code out of the way, then talk about it.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and create a new namespace underneath the code namespace called abstract, and then I'm going to generate an interface called iGameState. Underneath iGameState, I'm going to have two methods. void update, and void render.
Inside of it.
Then on Game Manager, Game Manager is going to have a reference to the current state that is being used. So we're going to do public iGame state, current state, get public set, which I don't do very often, but I'm doing here. Void update, or public void update, if current CS does not equal null, cs.update. And then, of course, we're going to do our public void on GUI, which I'm going to go ahead and say if CS is not null, CS render. I do want to point out that I've used quite a few ReSharper shortcuts to get this code up and running. I was trying to type kind of slowly to compensate for that, but hopefully people saw a bunch, the value of ReSharper.
Well, there's not much code, and it's going to be there on the screen for a little while you talk about exactly what's going on. And I imagine it wouldn't be at all surprised to see the whiteboard come out at some point. So,
Nelson, do you know if the latest ReSharper 7 is stable enough to work with? I don't use the latest version of Visual Studio. However, the private student that I work with does. And as a necessity, he also uses the latest EAP version of ReSharper 7. In fact, I recall that they just actually went into beta recently, which means that he is using the EAP version, which is the early access version before beta, and that worked just fine. There were not any issues using that with Unity. How do you get the Solution Explorer to show up? The window menu at the top. Sorry, I didn't see that was answered. Okay, so the code I have here, everybody go ahead and get this written out, because this is very important. I'm going to go ahead and reset everybody. Get this code written out, get your abstract namespace in, your iGame state implemented, and so on. How many people are not familiar with interfaces or polymorphism? Oh.
You had to ask, didn't you?
Well, what we're going to be doing here is we have this public interface iGame state, and then we have a game manager that contains a game state. The reason we do this is so that we can create objects that we refer to as game states that are not mono behaviors. Now, of course, they'll reference mono behaviors and work with mono behaviors and act upon mono behaviors, but they themselves will not be mono behaviors. They will just be simple classes. Those classes will be things like lose screen state, or playing game state, or start screen state, or win screen state. Those states will be classes that implement the iGame state interface. By implementing the iGame state interface, we can set instantiated objects of those types to the current state property of our game manager. By doing that, by setting the current state property of our game manager, we've effectively tied into Unity. So go ahead and I think I'm probably going to have to whiteboard this out just so that people are on.
Well, I was going to say, do you have off the top of your head the Gang of Four definition of this? Because that really turned a light bulb on for me.
I mean, I could look it up, but I don't know off the top of my head.
True, but I really do. I really do. No, I think the whiteboarding is a great idea, Nelson.
Okay.
So for those of you joining us for the first time with one of Nelson's whiteboarding sessions, please buckle up, hang tight, and try not to have a
Prepare to laugh.
No. No.
Don't laugh at me. I'm trying.
No. Yes, he is.
But I am waiting for people to get this code up, because it's really not code.
If you're still typing this code and participating, please hit 1 more minute.
There you go. Thank you, guys. Awesome. I love when we have an interactive class. Ooh, you guys rock. You guys are very interactive tonight.
Ryan, in what way are your methods different?
Methods are different. How do I fix it? I'm not sure. Hold on. You have while he types the response to that. You have a namespace in your iGame state CS. I thought Unity did not support namespaces. Unity does. Well,
Mono
C# does. Mono behavior doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. C# and Mono support namespaces. Obviously, namespaces are a very important aspect to C# and other .NET languages. It's just that mono behaviors cannot be in namespaces because Unity doesn't understand how to locate classes that are in namespace.
Exactly. And as Nelson just pointed out a second ago, namespaces are extremely important. So we will be making use of them. We just can't use them in actual mono behaviors. So the game manager script on the left-hand side, that CS file we're inheriting from mono behavior. It cannot be in a namespace.
And this goes back to why when I do folder setup for this, what Nelson has called scripts, I call monos or mono behaviors, just to keep it straight in my own head. Anything that's a mono behavior doesn't want its namespace, and I use the resharper refactor namespaces a lot when I'm moving code around. And so it's a reminder never to touch that folder. Anything that's in that folder shouldn't be in a namespace of it. Wow, that killed the conversation.
Yeah, way to go, Gavin.
Jeez, man. Okay, so I think we're just about at the point where we've got enough completed. All right, one more minute. There's just a couple more. Remember, when you're done, except for poor Creative, who's having to quickly get Visual Studio back up, make sure to go ahead and complete the task or let the system know that you're ready.
Labyrinth, unexpected token. See, now this, can I do my please read error messages and don't just be frightened by them thing? Because it is appropriate. Unexpected token, what? And in fact, if you double-click on that error, it should take you to the place in code where you have written.
Depending on if he's using Visual Express, Studio Express, no, it will not.
Oh, will it not? Oh,
no.
Well, wherever it tells you that is happening, it should at least give you a line number.
Actually, just a quick tip. Even in Express, this better work. I'd be very disappointed if it didn't. Go ahead and hit Control-Shift-B. That should always succeed. Even though the build artifacts produced by doing a build within Visual Studio are completely ignored by Unity, remember, Unity has its own C# compiler. That being said, they're the same language. So if I do a Control-Shift-B and I have a syntax error, like right here, if I do that and do Control-Shift-B, notice how I get an error list that pops up that allows me to view this within my editor.
Oh yeah, that will happen. It's just that you can't double-click on that error and have it take you to the right line in Express.
You can if you're looking at the error list, but not if you're looking at the Unity console. Because if I have a syntax error right here, and I jump in here, with Express I wouldn't be able to double-click on this if I had Express. Now, if I had Pro like I do, or my
unexpected token is a VS error. It'd be unexpected. As it turns out, he had .assets, .code, .abstract. It was fixed while you were...
I'm getting the error assets, code, abstract, iGameState is less accessible than property, game state, manager, current state.
He's got resharper. When resharper makes them, it will make them internal.
Okay, remember, once again, once you get there, go ahead and click the I'm done button. Yeah, NATO, you should know to PM Zach. I'm sure you do.
No, NATO, you need to go to Website Spark and click the button that says, yes, I do one day plan to host a website. And then
exactly for
it for 3 years for free.
That's right. So please listen to what Gavin just said. It's critical. For any of you that are running Express, you can get your hands on Visual Studio Professional for free. Free. Listen to Dave, man. Dave speaks wisdom. He just put it over in BuzzNet.
If you're a student, they have something else called DreamSpark. It's the same program as Website Spark. Website Spark, rather, is the same program as DreamSpark, except for not students. But the way, check into the, because I keep saying this and I haven't checked for years since I signed up for it, but when the end user agreement for it that you had to sign basically said, I run a website, or I intend one day to run a website.
That's right. And we all intend to, because we are all going to put up our basic games in a web compiled version. Booyah! There you go. See? Everybody should feel good. I feel good. You feel good, Gavin? Huh?
I feel great. Daniel brings up a great point. He has the inconsistent line endings warning. That you can ignore. It will just, yeah. That is because when Unity creates things, it does it with macOS line endings, which I always forget which way around. Is that R or D? Or R or N?
That's just N. It's just /N.
It's just N.
That's in all Unix systems are like that.
Does it Windows way, which is different. Because I always read that, it looks like RNLI, which over here is the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. But, yeah, ignore that error, anyone who gets that.
And as Dave also said, you can get Visual Studio 2012 for free right now, and that's a fact.
Okay, so let's go ahead and fire up Photoshop. Or, well, I'm going to fire up Photoshop. You guys don't have to. I mean,
Yeah, it's going to be RC.
If you wanted to draw along with me.
There was one other question, Nelson. I've just flagged it in green. It's a bit more.
My Solution Explorer isn't showing the assets folder. It's really annoying. You probably didn't launch the CS proj. You probably launched the individual CS file. So, for example, if I close down Visual Studio and I open up, like if I jump into Assets, Code, Scripts, Game Manager, and double-click on this, what I'm going to get is a problem sending a command to the program. And after I hit OK and double-click again, what I'm going to get is Visual Studio just loading in a single file. And it's not going to give you any of the features that you would expect from Visual Studio because it's only opening a one file. It's not even going to open up the Solution Explorer. And now you see this My Solution Navigator comes up because that's from a plugin. But notice how I don't get IntelliSense? There's no IntelliSense, there's no ReSharper. That's because I didn't load a project. I loaded an individual CS file. So to fix this, what I would do is I would jump into the week2-c#.slin. Now, if I double-click on this, what I'm going to get is what I had before, where Visual Studio launched an entire project, not just an individual file. I probably shouldn't have closed this because it could take forever to load.
Yeah, I was going to say sometime in the next few weeks.
While that's opening, Stuart said, when I build in VS, I always get the output window. I believe that because you're building and running rather than just building. So if you hit F6 instead of F5, or whatever Nelson says the other shortcut is.
I use Control-Shift-B, and if I hit F5, I'll get a project with the output type of class library can be started directly. Which makes sense because this is a class library.
Yeah. And actually, you can see it the opposite way. If you ever, like me, are a bit nosy and you decide to try and use Unity Engine just as a reference in a non-Unity project, you'll get all sorts of strangeness happening because it checks to see whether it's being run in Unity.
It's actually not so much that it checks to see that's being run in Unity. If you actually decompile the Unity Engine managed assembly, you'll notice that a vast majority of the logic, while they are C# methods, they actually defer to native code. And that native code is only going to be present when you're running in the Unity process. Otherwise, that native code won't be present, and you'll get exceptions everywhere.
And somebody said, why my current state is on red. iGame state 2.
Do you have a using statement? Do you have the code written right? I don't know. That can mean anything.
That is, he's just put it in. It's Gabriel at the bottom there.
Oh, okay.
And it sounds like he's not.
Yeah, it looks like you're missing a using statement. If you'll notice up here, the iGame state interface is within the namespace assets code abstract, which means that you'll need a corresponding using statement on Game Manager for using assets code abstract.
Ah. Christopher That is a brilliant question to bring up because it is guaranteed to make you destroy your code. He said, I have a warning under onGUI telling me to use onGUI Pascal case instead.
Ooh, right. What you'll want to do is you'll want to create, there's two things. First of all, you'll notice that whenever I use one of the Unity magic methods, I always make them public. That's because ReSharper notifies me when private methods aren't being used, because there's no way for ReSharper to know that these should be used, because the developers of Unity decided to completely forego the actual standardized and more appropriate ways of handling things such as overriding members or interface implementation, in lieu of doing some sort of messy reflection that I have no idea what the reasoning behind was. So you'll notice that ReSharper is incapable of knowing that this method is being used anywhere, so it'll tell me to delete it. That's why I make these public. And not only that, if you do not add GUI to your abbreviation list in ReSharper, you'll get a nice, huge, bold squiggly saying, well, GUI doesn't match the naming conventions that you told me to match for. You can just Alt-Enter, add GUI to abbreviation, and you'll be good.
There are two that I've flagged in green.
When I write public interface iGameState and iGameState.cs, Visual Studio keeps crashing.
Shouldn't be a public interface for a start, should it?
Yeah.
Or should it? Oh, yes. Sorry, I was getting my brain.
If the update method is called start, is that a big deal? If you called this method start, then it's not going to work. These names are not...
What we were talking about, magic methods. In mono behaviors, when you're using them in Unity, there are about 5 methods, some of which you will use. There are awake, start, update, and onGUI. Those are your primary methods that are called magically behind the scenes by Unity once every frame. Well, no, that's update's called once every frame. onGUI is called once every frame. Awake is called immediately when you start, when you first build the thing, and start is called once just before update the first time. Wow, I got all of those right.
Actually, onGUI can be called multiple times per frame.
Yes.
Can it?
In fact, it generally is, yes.
It's really bizarre. That's something
Which is why... I was just going to say real quick, for those of you that have heard, onGUI is horrible to use with mobile devices. That's why.
Yeah, I had to become very intimately familiar with how onGUI when developing CGS.
Like Lance just said over in BuzzNet, yeah, it shoots the draw calls through the roof.
That's horrible.
Yep.
That's another reason. Because basically, my approach to dealing with sort of Unity and C# has been to try and stay out of mono behaviors as much as possible. And this is no doubt due to my extensive brainwashing by Nelson. But it does make sense because there are all these odd restrictions and magic things that happen behind the scenes with mono behavior that aren't there with general C# coding. And so, well, for instance, the way we've set the game state system, this will drag us back to the subject, but the game system is set up in such a way as you'll notice we've got a render method rather than onGUI. That could have been called onGUI, but it would have been somewhat confusing because onGUI is a specific thing to Unity behind the scenes.
Current state does not exist in the current context. Many reasons why that might happen. Do you have a property, a public non-static property named current state with this casing declared within the class that you are referencing in your method? And I just realized, actually, the person who asked if the update method is called start, is that a big deal? I actually just realized that I believe start is one of the methods that appear when you generate a mono behavior. Just delete that.
It is. You get start and update.
Yeah, just delete that code. Well, I mean, I guess you could leave update, but whatever. It's not that difficult. Type back in when you need it.
Basically, make sure your code looks exactly like this. Capitalization matters. Punctuation matters. These are just general statements on language, nothing specific to programming.
Yeah, if you get a message saying that OnGUI does not match your naming conventions, put your keyboard cursor on the word OnGUI, hit Alt-Enter, and say add GUI to the abbreviation list. That's a facet of ReSharper, and it's nothing more than a warning.
Well, yes, Palm said this will make Gad fail your homework if it doesn't match. Yeah, the reason I pushed that, and particularly more so in the earlier classes, is because of things like this. The number of, you'll see it all over the site in threads where people have got bugs with their code, and it's just down to the fact that they've misspelt something, or they haven't punctuated correctly, or things are miscapitalized. You need to be pedantic.
There is a list of Unity special methods somewhere.
Okay,
that's in the
Nelson,
documentation.
let's go ahead and
All right, I'm going to go ahead and actually...
that are available in documentation. Absolutely. All I got to do is just go into Unity's help and go to mono behavior, and you'll see them all.
All right, this should be a fairly straightforward diagram, I hope, if I can diagram well. See, I haven't diagrammed in a while.
That's beautiful.
Yes. Okay. So what we have here is we have Unity, we have our game manager, then we have our states, and then we have our other game objects. Very straightforward architecture. So for example, Unity will Unity ties into our game manager magically. Our game manager is a mono behavior within Unity. Unity knows how to poke it when it needs to, for example, update. So when the game manager, when Unity tells the game man, whoa, it's a big eraser. When Unity tells the game manager to go ahead and update, what we're going to do is we're going to defer that to the current state. So we're going to select the current state, and we're going to invoke its update. When Unity invokes our onGUI, with a line that's less horrible than that, we're going to select out our current state and invoke the render method. Now, what the current state is where the polymorphism comes into play. Because we can have as many different states as we want, just as normal C# classes that implement the iGameState interface. So I can write a state like how about start game state. And what does the start game state do? Well, it renders the splash screen.
What are we going to call that start screen state?
I can't remember. Start game state renders the splash screen and then checks for user input. And then starts the game if the user indicated that he wants to do that. When the game starts, there's a state transition. How do you draw arrows? That's not how you draw an arrow. Wow.
Wow.
I'm not even going to try. Triangle. Okay. Now the start game state is going to delegate into the game state. What's the game state going to do? Well, it's going to manage our game objects. During a game. Now, if the player loses, what we're going to do is we're going to have a state transition into the lose game state. Which displays a message to the user. if the game player wins, we're going to transition into the win game state. Which is simply going to display a message. Now, when both of these states know that the user wants to go ahead and start a new game, they're both going to go all the way back into the start game state. Okay, is everybody good with this sort of flow of logic? Okay, so what?
I was just going to say, because the definition I was talking about earlier, the Gang of Four definition of a state machine, is that it makes the bit that I was focusing on is that it makes it seem as though your objects have changed into a different type of object. I.e., they have different behavior
Exactly.
with the same action.
I mean,
in this case, for instance, if you chose to press A to start the game, well, on the start screen state, you're going to want that to be recognized as just pressing any key and moving into the game state. Whereas in the game state, you're going to want A, meaning move left.
Mm-hmm. So we want each state to be in control of managing the game objects that they need to manage. Which, of course, does actually, when I say that, when I do this sort of diagram, I don't mean that any parts of these are mutually exclusive. Obviously, game objects are a facet of Unity itself. So even within this architecture, there's really not a complete abstraction of Unity, because the states will be operating with game objects. But it's still useful to sort of think that each one of these states will take in user input and decide what to do with the game objects that they're responsible for. So what we have here, I'm not even going to, well, maybe. Wow.
I only discovered that works a few weeks ago, the dot to dot.
I found out yesterday.
I realized that.
Okay, so now that we have these awful they're not rectangles, they're, trapezoids, drawn around our states, there's an interesting way that we can represent these states in programming design. And that is, each one of these states will be a class. So we'll need to represent the start state, the game state, the lose state, and the win state. Each one of these represents a single class. And what's the commonality between all these classes, people?
Marvin for the win.
Yep.
He was the first. This is the great thing about iGameState. Basically, what we need is to not be reliant on knowing in the game manager, or rather the game manager not to be reliant on knowing whether it is in the start state, the game state, the lose state, the make ice cream state, or the drink margarita state. It shouldn't have to care about the specifics of what the states do. It just says, oh, hey, here's some input. And whatever the current state is, deals with that. But in order to do that, you need to have this commonality
An interface.
of all your states.
Like in the English definition.
The interface comes in.
Yeah, the English definition.
Yeah, yes. It's a way of looking at an object in a particular way and interacting with it in a particular way. Basically, it's guaranteeing, in this case, that you're going to have methods called update and render. And actually, when Nelson goes back in the code in a bit and starts implementing the specific, the concrete versions of these states, you'll see that the errors that come up basically exemplify that. They'll say, well, wait, this can't be an iGame state because it doesn't have an update and it doesn't have a render, for instance.
Right, and if it doesn't have an update or a render, then how can Game Manager possibly interact with it? Because all Game Manager knows is the abstraction. And the abstraction is the iGame state. Okay, so it's been about an hour. Do you guys want me to leave the code up on the screen, or do you want me to leave this diagram on the screen? See, why can't you draw?
I'd leave the code on the screen because there are a few people still copying it, and this will be essentially going over as you build the concrete methods. So I'd leave the code up. Hello?
Hey. Well, yeah, I heard what you said, and then I look at BuzzNet, and everybody's like split between the two.
Pick something and do it.
Well, I kind of like my diagram. I worked hard on that. Oh, someone really wants the code up on the screen. You know, we're going to be spending so much time discussing this, that's going to hit the 2-hour mark. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave the code up on the screen and pause it. And we're back. So, questions. Why is current state of type iGameState? Because it is. Like you saw in the diagram, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a bunch of different state classes. And all of the state classes that we create have to plug into the game manager. And to plug into the game manager, what we need to do is we need to create a common base type. And the base type that I chose to create was called iGameState. If you do not know what interfaces are or how to use them, I mean, if you know what inheritance is, think of an interface as a sort of anemic base class. Although it's a lot more complicated both in implementation and in design. If you come from a language that does not have interfaces, then that is what it is. If you still don't know what interfaces are, be sure to check out C# 102 because we spent a lot of time talking about interfaces.
We do. And Nelson, can you jump around in questions? Let's go ahead and answer Ryan real quick. I'll tag that one for you, green.
When I type namespace assets code abstract, there's an error message that goes before the using statements in game. When I type namespace assets code abstract, there's an error message that goes before using statements in game.
Have you take a close look at line 1 of each of those two files? They are not the same. The one on the left says using assets.code.abstract. The one on the right says namespace assets.code.abstract.
Right, they're fundamentally different.
Well, one is using the other. That's the key.
Right.
Do you want to just take that using out of game manager and show them what happens?
Yeah, if I take this out, you'll notice I start to get an error indicating that iGameState is not imported. Now you notice ReSharper is helpfully saying, well, you probably mean assets code abstract iGameState, but we will get an error in Visual Studio. And if I try to build, it'll say the type or namespace iGameState could not be found. So if I click on that, it imports a using, or brings in a using.
Nelson.
Yes?
That one.
So you want more than one class? We will inevitably be building more classes as the...
We've already got two.
Well, we've got a...
Well, we have two types.
We've got a class and an interface. Yeah, we have two types.
Then where does the namespace come in? A namespace is not a type. A namespace is an organizational unit in .NET. So you'll notice that because I have this interface within this namespace, and look closely, this namespace correlates with the folder, and I'm quoting that because what these are, they are folders, but they are actually namespaces, or you should conceptualize them as namespaces. So you'll notice that this namespace definition correlates to where this file is located on our hard drive, because you'll notice that it's assets.code.abstract, and that is the namespace. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time talking about namespaces.
No, I think that answered it, though. Okay, so a couple more. Ryan, I guess what I'm saying is if basically what he said was just very much straightforward. You'll really benefit yourself by watching the C# 101. It's an organizational thing, and the interface that has been created that's on the right side of the screen is not a mono behavior. On the left side, the class game manager, that is a mono behavior. It's extending mono behavior. That is not allowed to be in a namespace. So that's why it's not in one. But every object or every class that we create that is not a mono behavior will always be inside of namespaces. That is good programming practice.
Right.
And in fact, the first thing Nelson's about to do is create another folder.
Well, actually, there's one more thing we need to do to get past the first module. There's one more thing we need to do to get past the first module for this class.
Okay.
Out of 5.
And Ryan, are you using Visual Studio Express?
How do I display those two files side by side? Click and drag the tabs.
Okay, if anyone wants to help Ryan over in the, hang on. Tried to edit preferences to open this in Visual Studio. It didn't work. Visual Studio Express or Professional? Because with Express, it will not work. They don't allow anybody to externally tie in and manipulate it like that. And that's why, Ryan. You'll have to actually open the solution file yourself. I mean, it's no big deal. You just double-click on the solution file.
Right.
All right, Nelson, could you show that one more time, please? The sync and open?
Right. So what you're going to do if you do not have any sort of built-in IDE with Unity is you will right-click in your project and you will select Sync Mono Develop Project, which is an absolutely horrible name for that menu item, but that is the menu item you must click. When you click that and open up your Unity project in Windows Explorer, you will see that a variety of CS projects and slins got generated. You will want to open the week2-c#.sln file to open it up in your editor or your IDE.
So Ryan, hopefully that helped.
And if it says that Game Manager is underlined and says the wrong namespace, that is a ReSharper thing. Don't worry about that. That is just a warning. Okay, so the last thing to complete Module 1 out of 5 for this class is we are going to go ahead and plug our Game Manager onto our camera. So jump back into Unity. Make sure that your project window is open. Make sure that your hierarchy is open. Click on Game Manager and drag it onto main camera. After doing that, click on main camera, go to your inspector, and verify that the Game Manager script is indeed attached.
Now, this comes down to a personal preference. Ended up putting it here. Basically, it just needs to be on something that's in the scene to start with. Oftentimes, in more complex projects, I will make an empty game object in the project using Control-Shift-N, call that Game Manager, and put the Game Manager script on it. It can just make sort of finding where it is easier once you've got a project or hierarchy that's full of stuff.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to go ahead and do that.
In this case,
so I'm going to go.
Cool.
I'm going to go ahead and remove the Game Manager script off my camera by clicking on this little gear and saying Remove Component. Then I'm going to go to Game Object and create Empty, or hit Control-Shift-N. I'm going to rename this game object Game Manager, and then I'm going to click and drag the script onto our Game Manager, and then open it up in the inspector to verify that I completely failed in clicking and dragging. Do it again and verify that Game Manager script has been attached.
you're also going to want to go ahead and zero out your X, Y, and Z for...
Well, yeah, I mean, that's
This
benign.
is generally when you add... No, yeah, it is, but it is something that will catch you if you're not thinking about it. It doesn't automatically create things, even if you do them from the drop-downs, necessarily at any particular position that I can work it out. So it's always a good idea to double-check the transform in the inspector once you've created anything. And I like that at 000, just so I know where to find it.
Does it matter if it's on the camera or not? No, it doesn't. But if it's not on the camera, it's a little bit easier to look at the properties that we're going to be, or fields we're going to be adding to the script later down the line.
It does, however, need to be on something that is in the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. It has to be on an instantiated game object.
Because otherwise, basically, only things that are in the hierarchy are part of
Scene.
when your game is running. They're part of the scene. So if basically we're just putting on something here to make sure that it's included and calculated in by Unity and used at all.
And I agree with everybody over in BuzzNet. And don't forget to save.
Yes.
And Unity, like most other applications, does know how to explode from time to time.
All right, so there.
We did have.
Wow. There's one more question that I'm going to address. Last week you set the resolution to 800 by 600. Do we need to do that again? No. We will be talking about resolutions later. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and reset everybody's ready. Go ahead and hit ready if you are ready. 1 minute if you are still working, because this concludes 1 out of 5.
You will find that if you hit play, nothing of any interest happens.
Nope.
But the key thing is, nothing happened.
The most exciting game I've ever seen.
If you hit play, and you might get messages on missing scripts, you could get messages about, you could get things go wrong. So, yes, make sure that it does give you a nice cornflower blue.
Yep. Actually, I think it's a little bit deeper than the...
It is a bit deeper, and I imagine that's probably because cornflower blue is copyrighted by...
Well, and just an awful color.
And yes, and that too.
Okay.
You think that's bad? You've seen what color I set it to in the...
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, that was on purpose to verify things.
Yeah.
All right, so what do we got next? What's phase 2?
Okay, so now we're going to build all of our states. We're just going to stub them out, and we're going to show the transition between states. So if people are not familiar with code, this might be a little bit tricky. This should be fairly straightforward for people who are familiar with coding. So I'm going to jump back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to create all of my state classes. I'm going to create another namespace called states. And if you have ReSharper installed, by going into your Solution Explorer and hitting Alt-Insert, you get a nice little generate dialog box that I'm going to be using quite frequently. Okay, so inside of states, I'm going to go ahead and create a lose screen state. I'm going to go ahead and create a playing game state. I'm going to go ahead and create a start screen state. And notice, by the way, the key combo I'm using to bring focus from my editor into my Solution Explorer is Control-Alt-L. By doing that, focus goes onto my Solution Explorer, and I can hit Alt-Insert once again to bring in, let's say, a win screen state. Okay, so all of these states are going to implement iGameState. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, and first of all, if you type in iGameState right here, you'll notice that by default it doesn't get imported in. Now you could of course hit Alt-Enter to bring that in if you wanted to. Alternatively, another quick ReSharper shortcut that you should always use is actually Shift-Alt-Space. And if you hit Shift-Alt-Space and then start typing in iGameState, you'll notice that it appears in the IntelliSense even though it's not imported. And I can just hit Enter, and I get both the import as well as the code completion. Now you'll notice that our class definition has been squigglied. Can anybody guess why we have squigglies on our class definition?
Death by Squiggly.
Yes.
What happened to him? Oh, he was squiggly. They shouldn't have to guess, to be fair, because if you read the error that you will be told...
It's right at the bottom. It's kind of a dead giveaway.
In fact, it is actually on the screen. I hadn't noticed that, but it, yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is hit Alt-Enter, Enter. Enter. Then I'm going to hit Control-X, Alt, down arrow, Control-X. And by doing that, I now have an implementation of update and render in my windscreen state. Now,
and for people that don't have it, give them a hand real quick. Explain what just magically appeared everywhere.
Well, basically, they type that out.
Well, basically what just appeared is you'll notice that our iGame state, and yes, I did that all with keyboard shortcuts. We really need to do a ReSharper class at some point.
I concur.
The iGame state defines two methods that need to be implemented, update and render. So you'll notice that if, for example, my win screen state right here, because I implement iGame state, I have to also implement the update and render methods. Now notice how both these methods have a little icon in the gutter that indicates that they are implementing a member. In fact, if I put my keyboard cursor on update and hit Alt-Home, you'll notice it jumps right up into update on the interface. Now if I hit Alt-End, you'll notice it comes back down to my win screen state. So by showing that, we know that we have a correlation between these two methods, the one being a part of the interface itself and one being a part of the concrete class. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly just implement these two methods on all the other states, and then we'll talk about this a little bit in more depth. Wow, why can't I type anymore?
Now they can just copy and paste that stuff into all of them as well. So they don't have to type the exact same thing over and over and over.
True. Okay, so now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 states, and they all have the exact same definition. I'm going to go ahead and hit everybody's reset button, and let's see if we can get this all typed out.
And while everybody's typing that out, if you could take a look down there, that's what I get for not muting. If you could take a look in the question panel, a couple questions.
What did you do to get the game manager in the hierarchy? What I did was, and I apologize to everybody who's looking at the code right now, just give me one quick second. What I did was I created a empty game object. So I just said game object create empty. That created an empty game object in my hierarchy. Then what I was able to do was right click on that game object and hit rename. Or of course you can just double click slowly on it or hit F2 or whatever shortcut you prefer for renaming. So all the game manager is it's an empty game object that I renamed and then attached the game manager script to. Okay, so jumping back.
And you simply do that by dragging and dropping.
Yes. Can you say how to do that in ReSharper? Could you be more specific, please? Because I do like a lot of things in ReSharper.
Actually, I might as well just...
I think what he's talking about is the auto-implementing.
Oh, right. Well, in ReSharper, if you have the class name squigglied, you'll notice that if you put your keyboard cursor on it, this little icon appears. This little icon in ReSharper, whenever it appears, you can access it through the Alt-Enter shortcut. And by hitting Alt-Enter, now I can hit Enter to implement members. And that'll go ahead and implement all of my interface members. Now, obviously, I don't want my interface members to be throwing not implemented exceptions, so I'm going to go ahead and quickly just remove that code.
And if you look at what I've just flagged in green, you actually meant how to actually make the classes.
Oh, right. That's go ahead and jump into your Solution Explorer, focus on a folder. Now you'll notice I did that by hitting Control-Shift-L, and then I started typing in the name of the folder that I wanted, states, and I got that folder highlighted for me. But then what I can do is once that folder is highlighted, I can hit Alt-Insert. And after hitting Alt-Insert, I'll get a Generate dialog. So I can hit Alt-Insert and then C to get a class. I can hit Alt-Insert and I to get an interface. I can hit Alt-Insert N to get a new folder. I can hit Alt-Insert S to get a new struct. And you can actually customize those templates as well if you like. But again, I didn't do anything other than create these 4 classes and have them implement this one interface. That's all I've done so far. I haven't written any actual code. Well,
and remember, ReSharper doesn't, I mean, it appears like there's loads of stuff going on by magic, but literally all it's doing is writing out some code for you. It's not magically creating new types of code. It's literally saving you some typing. So you could have got the same result by literally typing in public class, playing game state, : iGame state, and so forth.
Well, exactly. I think
I just want to point that out because people go on about it's no quicker or well it is
It's
quicker because it's
quicker.
designed that way, but it's no different to going and right clicking on something and then going down to add. It's just a different set of shortcuts that you'll need to learn. Most of which are Alt Enter or Alt Insert.
monocarpal tunnel. So we're just copying this code into all 4 classes. Yes.
Yes.
What's the shortcut to auto-implement stuff? The shortcut to auto-implement your members is going to be put your keyboard... Now, this is when I say keyboard cursor, I mean that little blinking thing in the center of my screen right now, or in the top left of my screen. I guess in the top left quadrant of my screen, kind of to the right of the top left quadrant of my screen.
There is another keyboard cursor sat right in the middle of your screen.
Yeah, and then go ahead and hit Alt-Enter, and then Enter, and then Enter.
Nelson.
You what?
Nelson. There is a keyboard cursor sat right in the middle of your screen.
Oh, right. Well, that's my mouse cursor, actually.
Yeah, you might want to move that way because it's really confusing. Which model of DAS keyboard have you got?
I'll go ahead and link it. I'm actually going to go ahead and pause the video, actually. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and start implementing these states. Now, these states are going to have to reference an object that will give them the ability to access things such as textures that are selected in Unity, and also the ability to change states. As I noted in the diagram, our states are going to be responsible for deciding when it's appropriate for them to defer to another state. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to start with the start screen state, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a constructor with a parameter for game manager called manager. Then I'm going to alias that out into a private field. So again, the only code that's appeared is we have a private read-only game manager underscore manager field, and then a constructor of start screen state that takes in a game manager and simply aliases out the parameter to our local field. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start off with that. And now we're going to get our game manager to actually instantiate and use our start screen state. So I'm going to go ahead and split the window and go to full screen.
Yeah, because if you were to build it now, you'd get an error. Oh, no, you wouldn't. What would you?
Nothing. Nothing would happen.
Well, yeah. I wanted to ask about constructors and when they get called in comparison with everything else that goes on.
Well,
like awake and start.
Yeah.
That's why I hadn't used a constructor. I'd meant to mention that to you before.
Well, the constructors, you cannot add constructors to mono behaviors. You can only add them to simple classes, which means that the constructor will only be invoked when one of our mono behaviors or others types actually instantiate it. This, by using a constructor here, that Unity is never going to instantiate this. But instead what we're going to do is I'm going to create a method on Game Manager. Now, this is a magic method. And the magic method is simply going to instantiate a start screen state and pass itself in as the constructor parameter. Now, I know that public is squigglied on line 14. That is a very unfortunate bug with ReSharper. I'm going to hit Control-W, Control, comma, Control-Enter so that that squiggly goes away.
What he means by that is he's going to close that CS file and then open it again.
Yes.
Yes, start and constructors not being the same thing and parameters and the like.
Well, right. Constructors, mono behaviors are very magical things. And Unity makes a variety of assumptions about mono behaviors. Now, when I say assumptions, although I do, it kind of does leave a bad taste in my mouth. At the same token, these assumptions are indeed documented and something that people are going to have to keep in mind. Constructors will blow up. So for example, if I went ahead and did a constructor right here, this just won't work right at all. Constructors do not work with mono behaviors. As a result, we have two magical methods called start and awake. And remember, when I say magical method, I mean just a method name that doesn't isn't associated with anything else. This isn't an overload. Like I saw some people, I was reading through some documentation today, some Unity forums, and people were like, well, use the update overload, or the update override. And I kind of wanted to just, point out the fact that these are not overrides. These are not interface implementations. These are just magical methods that have magical names. And the magical names are picked up by Unity. Start is one of these. And start will be invoked at the start of your application when your mono behavior becomes available on a game object. So that is an appropriate place to put initialization logic. In this case, the initialization logic that I'm wanting to represent is simply instantiating a start screen state and assigning our current state to it. Was that right, Gavin?
You want to assign start screen state to current state.
Oh, okay, I had it backwards. Okay. So what we have here is some basic logic where we have our start screen state being instantiated in Game Manager, assigned, passed in, blah, blah, blah. So let's go ahead and I'm going to add some additional code because the start screen state is actually going to be very, very, very simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a public field to Game Manager. Now, everybody feel free to, slap me around for this, but it's a necessity when working with Unity. So I'm going to create a public texture 2D start screen background. Now there are a lot of better ways to do this, but this is the simplest, most understandable, and most straightforward way to do this. So as a result, that's what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to say public texture 2D start screen background. If you'll recall, because this is a public field, Unity becomes aware of it, and we will be able to set this field within Unity itself. We'll be able to set it to any other texture 2D asset in our assets folder. Now that I've given our Game Manager a public field, I can access that public field within my start screen state. So you guys ready for some awesome Unity GUI stuff? Check this out. I'm going to go ahead and say GUI dot draw texture. I'm going to pass in.
And you just imported the
yeah,
Unity engine namespace.
I did bring in the Unity engine namespace up here as a using GUI, and so is Rect, by the way. These are members of this namespace, and you must have a using import up there.
You did unpause, right, Nelson?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
just checking. I just saw Hector's reminder to unpause, and yeah.
Okay.
I think it'd be less confusing if you put it all back on one line.
Well, then it's cut off.
Move.
Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and put each parameter. This is typically the formatting that I do. When I need to break it out, I won't just break out one argument into a new line.
Yeah.
I'll break out all the arguments into new lines to be much more consistent.
And just, I don't want to confuse anyone who's new to coding. This is one line of code here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what he means by that is this is one line of code.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add some code to the update method. I'm going to say if input.anyKey down manager current state equals new playing game state. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit everybody's reset button, and let's see some 1 more minutes if you are still working on it. If you are ready, if you have written this code, please go into Paint, create a 10 by 10 black texture, and save it as a JPEG. I mean, that's the right format for this, right?
I don't tend to use JPEGs, but I would normally use a PNG or a TIFF.
All right. Well,
but, whatever. And yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're already ready, I'm going to put a note up here with the instructions. When done, create. Hey, I'm just saying 10 by 10. It could be anything really. And I'm just saying black, it could be anything. Image in Paint, and save it as a JPEG, PNG, or TIFF.
Unity's pretty good about importing graphics. It's just that, so generally speaking, I tend to use whatever comes to hand, really.
Yeah, I typically use...
I'm intrigued as to which what are you using that for?
Just so people can follow along without having the background images.
Oh, right. Well, they're not going to see anything if it's black.
Well, no, they will see the absence of blue.
Go into open up Paint and draw a pretty picture. No, actually, it would be more helpful to have something that's got some pattern on it, because you'll show up the problem you've got with screen res properly.
Well, I mean, I'm expecting it to tile, really. I'm not super concerned about, or stretch. Don't worry about the name or location yet. We'll talk about that later. I read that TIFF is best when using transparencies. Is that true? TIFF deals with them very well. So do pings. Pings deal with transparency very well as well. PNGs is typically the format that I'm generally used the most often because I'm used to using PNGs exclusively in the web world. Yeah, 10 by 10 in pixels. The size doesn't matter. Just get something. Have a picture. I mean, if you have a picture of your dog, then you're already done.
Did you say what to name it?
No, the naming is irrelevant.
Because it will matter. Okay.
Well, when we import it, we'll talk about naming. Well, if you have a cat.
And please, show that you're done when you're done with the code. Really, you just need an image. You don't need to go and draw an image to just get an image.
Yeah, well,
it's a splash screen.
Just get something. Have something on hand. I mean, I'm sure most of you have something on hand, but I figured, for people who are ready, it'll give them something to do and have the opportunity for them to alter it in the future.
Nelson, do you have a set of textures you would like to just shoot over on Skype and I can put up for people to download?
We have the basic ones from the shooter game. If you want me to RAR those up, or is it 7-zip those up to you and send them?
Sure.
Everyone actually already has access to those assets from the downloads page in the member sponsor lounge.
Oh, that's a good point.
And actually, get them from there, because then you have to be on the sponsor.
Oh, does that include the ship?
That includes the ship as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, well, I guess don't draw anything. Fine. I thought it would be cool.
For those who don't know, if you go into the member sponsor lounge, you will find one of the stickies at the top is called something like streaming video support files. Go into there and then follow the link in that thread to...
Leave it, pause it right there for a second just for people to see.
Streaming video support files. And then if you go into the first post of that, and follow the link there, and you are looking for the ones under Unity Simple Shooter or something.
Thanks, 3D Spider.
Are they not? Where did I get them from?
Where did you get them from?
Oh, good. Now, that's because the videos were downloadable and they were all linked from the same place. There was I'll go and dig for the thread. Hang on a sec. Let me open Firefox. Hey, this isn't my fault. This happened before I worked here. I blame Jeff. For old time's sake.
Oh, poor Jeff.
I blame Jeff. He's sabotaging the competition. What am I looking for? 3D bus.
Okay, so I see a lot of grain, so I assume that a lot of people have all of this implemented and written down and compiling. Make sure that it compiles. Go ahead and hit Control-Shift-B. Although that doesn't actually have any impact on anything because build artifacts are discarded, or more appropriately, they're simply not used, it will give you a nice little indication as to whether or not you have any syntax errors. Can you cover how to get rid of the squiggly under start screen state this again? Start screen state this. Is there a squiggly under this? I don't see a squiggly under this. Is there supposed to be a squiggly under this?
If he hasn't got the namespace, there'll be a squiggly under it.
So something like...
If you could actually tell us what the error message is, it would be more helpful than just saying a squiggly, because there's many variations of squiggly.
Yeah, ReSharper.
Squiggly than others.
Yeah, ReSharper tends to squiggle anything it can get its hands on. Okay, seeing as there aren't any questions and we are waiting on getting some assets.
I've got...
We did have an error coming in.
Goodness sake. Copy link location.
Okay, we got...
Yeah, it's exactly what he was saying about it. Well, go ahead and help Sean.
I have just posted the link in BuzzNet for the assets.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and download this myself so I have exactly what you
MMO
said.
Dust, it sounds like you have the most awesome picture of them all. Use it.
And this is the thing, these aren't even the screens that we're going to be using necessarily for the final version.
No, they're not. They're just
As you see,
placeholders.
they come from another project. These are just placeholders, so really you can use whatever picture you want. But if you're one of the people, like I always used to be, who has to have everything exactly the same.
And Hector, yes, ReSharper is going to think that your game manager needs to be in a namespace, but it can't for Unity's sake.
Nope.
Because it's a mono behavior.
Okay, Sean, the typer namespace name screen state cannot be found. Look very closely at the parenthesized text. Are you missing a using directive or assembly reference? Well, let's look at the first one. Are you missing a using directive? Now think about what namespace start screen state is under. The namespace start screen state is under is assets code states. That means you need a corresponding using directive up here in Game Manager to be able to see this type.
And when Nelson says under like that, he means inside?
What did I say? What?
Under.
Under?
We say it's under this namespace. I find it incredibly confusing. It's not. It's inside the namespace.
I always say it's under this namespace.
Yeah, you're wrong.
Well,
that's why I pointed it out.
No. Okay, so while everybody is grabbing the assets, it's been about another hour, so I'm going to go ahead and hit pause, and we're back. Okay, so one question came in sort of off topic, but I will just address it really quickly. Is it called mono behavior due to the mono project, or because it's a single behavior as opposed to a hypothetical dual behavior or whatever? The name mono behavior, I am sure, is simply an aspect of the mono behavior type being implemented within mono. So I don't think that it's that this has a single behavior. I think that this is named that way because, well, it comes from mono. This is the mono API.
Yeah.
And then the other one, is there a Unity convention for how and where to store graphics and audio assets? We will talk about that right now, actually. Okay, so I assume that everybody has this stuff working. So if we jump back into Unity and try to play the game, you'll notice that not only do we not get anything, we also get an error. Well, we get a lot of errors. Let's take a quick look at the console window. There's only one button that I care to go over in the console window, and that is the collapse button. Well, there's two buttons. There's clear and collapse.
There's one I want to go over.
Yeah, well, maybe there's three buttons.
Which is error pause.
Well, yeah. Okay, let's just go over the console window really quickly. The first button is clear on play. That button should be fairly self-evident. Whenever you hit the play button, clear on play, whenever you hit the play button, if clear on play is selected, the console will be cleared. The next button is clear. What do you think clear does? Well, it clears the console window. The next one is collapse. What collapse will do, if you check this, is it will only show unique messages. So you'll notice if I uncheck it, we see that our console window is continuously scrolling. That's because we have an error appearing on our onGUI, and because onGUI is invoked at least once per frame, possibly more, we get a continuous stream of errors. So the collapse button is very useful because it allows us to only pay attention to the unique messages in the console window. Finally, another option is the error pause. So if I go ahead and stop this and clear out my console window and hit error pause, and I hit play, notice how there's an error, and now we're paused.
I leave this turned on all the time. Because it stops as soon as it gets to an error. This can make it just that little bit easier to see what's happening when and why.
Right.
I find, because you'll just hit an error and it will pause immediately, rather than throwing out another load of errors.
Exactly, and that's the thing about Unity. The way Unity handles errors is that whenever an error is thrown, so for example, right now the error is being thrown right here because this texture hasn't been set to anything. Whenever an error is thrown, an exception is thrown. The call stack will be unwound until it reaches Unity. What do I mean by that? Remember that Unity will magically invoke our onGUI method. So if you can conceptualize this, we have Unity as this big box over here, and Unity is invoking the onGUI method. Our onGUI method is invoking our states render method. Our states render method is throwing an exception, which means execution for this call stack halts right here in line 23 and goes all the way back into Unity. So no other code on onGUI will execute. But once it jumps back into Unity, all Unity does is it eats the exception, it prints out an error, and it goes on its way. Now I find that behavior to be very obnoxious, and like Gavin, having error pause selected will actually go ahead and pause your entire program the second an exception is caught. You should never, ever have exceptions being thrown in Unity during gameplay, despite the fact that Unity does its best to eat them, which is kind of annoying. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix this error. Can anybody guess what we're going to have to do to fix this error? In fact, let me go ahead and show you guys this error. It says...
Update flash.
Yeah. Well, apparently. You'll notice this error says unassigned reference exception. The variable start screen background of Game Manager has not been assigned. You probably need to assign the start screen background variable of the Game Manager script in the inspector. Again, reading error messages is very important. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create a folder inside of my project called textures.
Now, see, I would create a folder called resources.
We don't, for right now, we don't need resources.
Okay.
And because of that, I don't want to get into...
Okay.
We will...
Okay.
We will later.
On your head be it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just saying we're already like an hour and 40 minutes in. We're still in the second module.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I created a folder within my project called Textures. And I have a Windows Explorer folder right here that contains the assets that we previously downloaded. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the, I'm going to select the space shooter start.png in Windows Explorer. I'm going to click and drag and drop it into my textures folder.
Can I suggest you bring in the other two screens as well at the same time? Because as of the most recent versions of Unity, you can actually edit multiple things at once.
Oh, well, that sounds like
You have
fun.
no idea how, if you've only recently used Unity, you have no idea. You used to have to go through every single image and do things individually to them and tell it to apply them and then go to the next image. And it was just a nightmare.
Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and select all of these except for the one I already imported. Click and drag and dump them into textures. We will be using all of these textures. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep these names the way they are simply because we are built. Well, I'm just going to say, you know what? I'm going to rename these. I'm going to say this is game lose. I didn't mean to do that. This is going to be game start, and this is going to be game win. Okay, so now we have...
To be honest, it doesn't... the actual specifics of what you name them aren't that important. Obviously, lose, start, and win would seem to be logical names to give them. The important thing is that you know what you've called them.
Exactly.
Because you're going to need that information. Well,
yep, just like anything else in programming, the names rarely matter as long as the names match up somewhere to something. I'm also going to capitalize this L because that's bugging me. Hotkey to rename F2. Okay, so now we have all of our textures in. I'm going to jump into the Game Manager game object. I'm going to go into the inspector window, and hey, look. We have this start screen background now. Where did that come from? Well, like I said before, in the previous class, that came from this public field. Notice how it's a texture 2D. Unity recognizes that it's a texture 2D and will only allow us to select another texture from our project that's compatible with it. We do that by hitting this really weird little icon right here, this little circly thing, and we click on it. And we get a nice little Select Texture 2D dialog box. And I can go ahead and double-click on Game Start. And we now have Game Start selected.
the other way to do that is just to grab your Game Start texture and drag it onto there.
Yep. So in your project window, what you can do is you can click on Game Start, click and drag, and dump it right on this field itself. Okay, now when I go ahead and hit start,
Dun, dun, dun.
and if I hit any key, sweet. So if I jump back into code, let's go ahead and explain this code. Again, I hope people understand this field right here because I just explained it. I hope people also understand the current state equals new start screen state this, because we are instantiating the initial state to the start screen state class. If we jump into the start screen state class, we have two methods that are implemented. We have the update and render. Now the render method, all that does is does GUI.draw texture. That's really straightforward method that shouldn't need any explanation beyond the name itself. It is a GUI mechanism of drawing a texture. It's important to realize, however, that anything that you access on the GUI class must be accessed through an on-GUI. Now, if you tell me that this isn't an on-GUI, I will slap you, because it is. Notice here that on our game manager, when we do on-GUI, we invoke the current state.render method. That means that
In fact, go ahead. I was going to say, go ahead and move that, what you've got selected on line 25, move that to line 20.
Right, so if I go ahead and move this, I just delete that, move this, paste it there, and go back and run this, you'll notice that we don't get anything. We get a null reference exception, and if you look at the null reference exception, it's just a bunch of garbage, basically. This is Unity's way of saying, hey, something broke. If you see stuff like this, make sure that anything that you access underneath GUI is accessed under an on-GUI, which again it is because the on-GUI method here that's invoked by Unity delegates to our current state.render, which ends up here on line 23. So this GUI method invocation, or the draw texture method invocation, is indeed a part of an on-GUI. And then notice how...
I was actually angry. I was expecting to see a specific error message because I've had it come up before where it does specifically tell you, well, this is a part of GUI. You should be using this from an on-GUI, and you're not. Sometimes
it does, sometimes it doesn't. I've seen the same behavior where I was actually expecting that to happen too. But I've also... No, as long as it...
But
on the same token, I have spent a lot of time with Unity's GUI stuff, and I've gotten some of the most bizarre messages ever from it. Okay, so this method takes in two parameters that should be fairly straightforward. It takes in a rectangle and an image. And I don't think that needs much explanation. The rectangle represents the rectangle where the texture will be drawn. The texture represents the texture that's going to be drawn. For a rectangle, we are passing in 4 parameters to its constructor. Left represents X, top represents Y, width represents, well, width, and we set it to screen.width, and height represents height, which again we set to screen.height. So it fills the entire screen with our texture. The next important...
Now be warned, I was going to say be warned on this. There are various things which we'll be getting to probably later in the course to do with screen resolution and screen resizing that will... there's various things you should be checking for safety, but just to get the most basic version in, you can literally just pass them in as we are here.
Right.
I just wanted to draw that caveat in before people came back saying, but everything's... In fact, depending on your screen res you're working at, it's probably going to be stretched.
Yep.
It certainly will if you maximize it, because it's a 4:3 image.
Yep. And one of the reasons we're not going to do that right now is also that also has implications to our actual camera position, our camera size, and other math that we're going to have to do later down the line. So that's going to be a discussion in itself. But for right now, this is the simplest way to do it, like Gav said.
But sorry, yeah, I did want to get that out there. But yes, the second parameter of draw texture.
Yep, second parameter
is
just the texture. And I'm accessing the public field of Game Manager that we set in Unity. Okay, the next method we're going to be looking at is update. Update is invoked on every frame. Update is when you will typically do simulation logic as well as input handling. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying if input.anyKeyDown. I did see a question scroll through, just a benign question that I might as well just say yes or no to. Is GUI a static class? And the answer is going to be yes. You're never going to instantiate a GUI.
I thought you were going to answer Chris's question.
Oh, well.
Can you debug in VS while Unity is running?
Oh, yeah, we'll get to that in a second. As you'll notice, actually GUI is not a static class, but it still isn't possible to instantiate it. If I dig through this definition, I'm sure there's a private constructor or something. And same thing with input. Input is another example of a class that you will never instantiate. You will simply access its static members. As I'm flipping through this this implementation, you'll notice that, and by the way, I'm using ReSharper's decompiler. You'll notice that it's just all static members. Also notice that if you ever decompile any of Unity, you will see this. You will see methodimple options.internal call. Yep. And that means that
Is that what we were talking about earlier?
That means that it actually reaches into the specific version of Mono that has been configured to support this call, and this translates into a C++ method invocation.
But at this point, we're starting to go a little bit beyond...
Okay, so stepping back a little bit, and our update method, which remember, the update method is invoked by Unity at the end of the day, but our game manager is going to delegate the update method invocation to our current state. So underneath the update method, what we're going to do is we're going to say if input.anyKeyDown, and if anybody asks me what this property does, then yeah. It should be fairly straightforward. It's a Boolean that indicates if, well, any key down.
You mean your DAS doesn't have an any key?
Fortunately, I've never been asked that by a client, but then again, I didn't work tech support in the 90s. I feel sorry for people who did. Okay, so I say if input.anyKeyDown, then manager.currentState equals new playing game state. We instantiate the new state, and we move on. Okay, so before I go on to actually implementing the playing game state for this particular module, and if you recall, we're still on module 2. Let me see, there's a question, why not make a class game state and have other states inherit from it? A game state class that implements iGameState and has the constructor. The reason is, there's a lot of reasons. The main reason is that's not needed. Keep in mind that if you have a base type that has a non-default constructor, you will still need to provide a constructor in the child types because in C# constructors are not inherited. So it'll pretty much be the exact same amount of code and accomplish absolutely nothing. That's not to say that I don't do that pattern every now and then. We talked about it in C# 102, where I have found it useful on occasion to create a base type that implements an interface so that that base type can provide some common functionality for the most common case of implementing that interface. Now, the good thing about that is it doesn't force you to implement a base class. You can still implement the interface directly if you want to, but it gives you some nice additional functionality on top of it. That particular...
Do you still... Sorry, I thought you'd come to a full stop.
I just have...
I was just going to say, do you still have the what I sent you, when I tried to make it just a splash screen state? Because that's essentially what I was thinking when I did that. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Self-referential looping.
You never...
Or did you just nuke that?
You never sent me that. Or at least you nuked it before you sent it to me. Okay, so
That's a shame.
so yeah, that's a pattern I don't typically do very often and is not appropriate for this case. But I don't have any reservations about doing it if it does provide value. Can you debug in Visual Studio while Unity is running? The answer is no. There is a project I'm keeping a close eye on that's supposed to allow you to do that, but as far as I'm aware, it is not available for open beta yet. I did try to get an invite, but I have not been made aware of it yet.
I don't know anyone who's heard back from that yet. There were quite a few people on 3D Buzz. It's just Unity VS or something like that it's called, isn't it?
Yeah, it has some name like that.
But yeah, that project kind of was a huge burst of excitement, and then no one's heard anything. But the short answer is no. You're stuck. Debug.log is your friend, and actually you probably should cover that today.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, actually that's a good idea. I'll do that after the states. But you can debug in monodevelop, however. Okay, so is the top left corner 00 point of the canvas? Yes. Keep in mind that when working with GUI, you will be working in not screen space, but you will be working in something that could be named screen space, but not to conflict with what screen space actually is. You are working with a coordinate system that starts at the top left corner of your screen and goes down to the bottom left corner of your screen. Obviously, that's a 2D plane, nothing that has to do with 3D. That's a very common scheme.
And it's in... Yeah, it's in pixels, hence the ability to pass in 0, screen dot width and screen dot height into GUI.draw texture there. This isn't UV space, which would be 0 to 1. And yes, as you pointed out, and I'm glad you did ask that question, it starts top left and comes down to the bottom right. Further, when we get more into the GUI stuff, which will be much later on, yeah, it will start to annoy you. But.
Well, to be fair, if you are familiar with working in stuff like websites or other GUI frameworks, that is a very common scheme. But on the same token, it will get kind of annoying because it's not in any way correlated to the way that 3D objects are positioned.
But yes, we'll get to that probably further down through the weeks because it's quite a big topic. Cool. Do you want to do playing game state next, or do you want to rattle off the other ones that are like this?
I'm going to go ahead and just scream through all the states and leave the code up. Because what I wanted to implement for the states at the moment is very simple. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to... I'll not do that. That was stupid. Blah, 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 blah. No, come on, ReSharper. Stop being stupid. There you go. Manager. Okay, update. I'm going to go ahead and say if input...
This is in playing game state for those of you like me who nearly had an epileptic seizure due to Nelson's random screen movement.
What am I doing? Okay, so then we'll do a windscreen state, passing in manager, else if input, get key down, key code, dot, I don't know, space, manager, current state equals new lose screen state, passing in manager, go ahead and generate a couple of constructors for me, ReSharper, do that, And then I'm going to go ahead and that's done for now. Lose screen state is going to be very similar to the start screen state. So for example, the lose screen state will do that. And then what it's going to do is it's going to pass in a lose screen background, which is a field I'm going to go ahead and generate, which is going to be a texture 2D. And then I'm going to go ahead into the win. I will cover all this code. This code is so repetitive.
You haven't deleted start screen texture from that one. Is what I was about to tell you.
You what?
You didn't need to create a new one for lose thing. You needed to rename the one you had. Go back into lose screen state.
Yeah. Well, I needed to generate the field on Game Manager.
Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. It's on, yeah, okay. See, this is the problem when you're flying around like this. I want you to use ReSharper, but I just don't want you to do it so fast.
Well, it's just a matter of, right now, I'm just typing out code, and once the code's written, I'm going to go over each one of these files. But they share so many common elements. Okay. They really do. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and jump into Unity. Again, I'll jump into the code one quick second once I verify that the code is indeed working, although I think it should be. Pass in the lose to the lose. Pass in the win to the win. Hit enter. Now I can hit enter. I can hit enter and it says you win. I can hit space and it says you lose. Alrighty. So, here's what I did.
What on earth did he just do?
The first thing I did was, well, actually, the first thing you should do is create 2 more texture 2Ds on your game manager. A lose screen background and a win screen background. Now I'm going to jump into the playing game state at the moment. These are the first 2 files I want people to go ahead and copy down because there are some changes. The changes I made to both these files was on this one I added 2 fields. And on this one, I added a constructor that is very similar to the constructor of the start screen state. Then I added this basic logic, which is just temporary placeholder logic. Obviously, you don't want whether or not you win the game to be determined by whether or not the player hit spacebar or return, because that would be
Well, you might.
Well,
that'd be a cool game if you didn't document it.
Oh, yeah, but then it would get old very fast once you figured it out. But what I did was I said if input.getKeyDown, keycode.return shouldn't need any explanation. Manager.current state equals new win screen state and lose screen state. Now notice how these 2 now take in a manager, the constructor parameter, although they didn't previously.
So, I do have a little bit to say about the keycode enum.
Okay.
For anyone who's used X and A particularly, note this. For a start, keycode.return is literally just the return key. It is the enter key on your main keyboard. It is a separate keycode from your number pad enter. Okay? So you need to do 2 checks for separate keys. Similarly, the top, and you've got alpha numbers and you've got normal numbers. Basically, it's just a question of having a look through what is in key code. There's a lot. Alpha 0 to 9 are the ones along the top row there. And keypad 0 to 9 are the ones for the number pad keypad. Similarly, divide, multiply, plus, minus. Just make sure, because the return one in particular, for some reason, has bitten me in the past. I expect return and enter to be just one check, but they're separate buttons, so yeah, it does make sense. Other than that, at the moment, I have nothing further to say.
Yeah, this is typically how it's like we're working with Unity. You just need to know what static class you need to access, what property of your game object you need to access, what settings do you need to flip to make something happen. And once you know those things, then working with Unity becomes a lot more straightforward, and you can focus on other things. That isn't to say that Unity has made the best decisions about working with things. As many of you no, there are situations in which I complain about Unity doing things that I don't think it should. That being said, it still is opinionated, and if you work with it to do the things that you want it to do, then it's all good. Then it's just a matter of learning the API. Okay, go ahead and hit 1 more minute if you're still typing out either of these files. And hit ready if you are not.
Most people should be nearly there, I would have thought, because there's only about 5-6 lines of code to add.
Yep, again, the biggest thing are these two texture 2Ds, and the update, and the constructor.
And to chime in what Mooseroot has put in BuzzNet, basically you should get in the habit of hitting F6 or whatever else.
Control-Shift-B.
Basically you should get in the habit of using F6. F6 will save, it will build and save all of the basically everything in your project. Control S only works on one CS file at a time.
Yep, it's a very, very important distinction. Another important aspect of Control-Shift, I don't know if building does this.
You see, I avoided that for that reason.
I don't know if building does this, but I do know that the Control-Shift-S, if you make a change to one of your, and this does not have to do with Unity because you don't ever change settings on your CS projects with Unity, but if you ever make a change on your CS proj, hit Control-Shift-S. One of the funny things about that is a change in your CS proj actually includes adding a file. So if you add a file and hit Control-S, left and right and build and do all that stuff, and Visual Studio crashes and you reopen up that same project, that file is not going to be in your Solution Explorer. It's going to be on disk, it's just not going to be attached to your solution or to your project. So Control-Shift-S and I think Control-B, although I just am not sure, will save not only all of your files but also all of your project settings.
I think that's probably, we need to move on to the other...
Yeah, the other files. Okay, so I'm going to close Game Manager. The other files that I implemented were the lose screen and the start screen.
And actually, if you could get lose screen, start screen, and win screen all up at once...
That's going to be a bit of a tricky thing, but let me try.
Can you does it do 3 columns?
I think I can. Well, hold on. That's the playing game screen. I don't think this is going to work. It's close.
Well, the key point is that they are almost identical.
Yeah. I mean, you guys can see the similarities between these files. The only difference, I'm going to go ahead and close loose screen state now that we've shown that's pretty much the same thing. The only difference between these files, the different screen states, is what state it defers to after a key was hit, and B, which texture it renders. So I'm going to go ahead and hit reset on everybody's ready. Go ahead and hit ready once you have the Unity project working like it does on mine.
So yeah, just to reiterate, in these, it's only line 18 and 25 that you'll need to change in windscreen and lose screen to differentiate them from start screen. And it's not entirely, well, it's not even remotely coincidental, this similarity. Each of these have basically the same functionality. In fact, they have the same functionality, really. They are, you can hit any key and it will just move on to the next thing. Which was actually what we want from the very first, the start screen. Obviously, for now, they just loop directly back, but you could have high score screens, you could have, pick a map, pick a level screens inserted in there as well. And this is where this system gets easy to extend, because you simply add another iGameState class, another class that instantiates iGameState, and drop in the relative hooks, pick the class that will open it, and off you go.
Well, exactly. And another thing, even without having, I mean, at this point, the only thing, like Gavin was saying, the only thing we're showing are splash screens. But even a lose game state could take in information. And now that we have a extensibility point, we have a point in which we can say, okay, I know this state's going to be active when we win. I want this information, that information, this other information to be presented now. And it gives you a nice little place to add that functionality, and there's a good structure here. And sometimes you will end up adding additional states as well, and sometimes you'll end up editing existing states. And there's a very common mantra in the programming world called "don't repeat yourself." And the spirit of "don't repeat yourself" doesn't apply to what we're looking at right now. It really doesn't. Because the spirit of "don't repeat yourself" is you shouldn't do the same thing twice. However, we're not really semantically doing the same thing with the start screen state and the win screen state. These are two completely different entities that do completely different things. Just because the implementations are so amnemic right now does not mean that the implementations will stay that way. And by delineating out our states like this, we get a very nice, clear architecture to our program and very clear points in which we can add functionality without making functionality go all over the place. Like a very common thing I see in Unity projects is, everybody builds just a bunch of mono behaviors, and the mono behaviors edit data on static classes, and they do all that stuff, and then it becomes an issue. Okay, so where is this code located? And it's located right here. It's accessing the static variable. Well, who else accesses the static variable? Well, everybody and their dog does. You don't know what the state of that static variable is at any point because there's no coherence. I didn't want this to become a class about design discussion. I wanted this to be a class about Unity. That being said, a state system is a very simple concept that has very wide-reaching implications. So that's why, it's a good thing to go ahead and implement.
Because at the moment, and take note of this, what we're dealing with is an iGame state. There's a reason why we didn't call it just iState. Not just the game can have a state.
Yeah, the state pattern.
And I'll just leave that hanging out there. Other things can have state, and will do in the near future. I want to answer Ty's question with another question. Is there supposed to be a blue screen between the start screen and the win-lose screens, he says. Well, Ty, look in your win screen and think about what happens. I know that wasn't a question, but
Well, yeah, and then
it kind of was a statement to form a question, because the point is, look at what the flow. In fact, if you've got the whiteboard open still, because that would probably make more sense to people now they've seen the code for it. Because this is what we've just put together. The framework of this flow of logic. Which screen goes to which screen goes to which screen. The game state, however, at the moment, obviously we haven't got any game logic in there. So do you think there should be a blue screen there or not?
Well, yeah, and look at the actual implementation of the game state, or the playing game state in this case. And think about what is the state doing? What is the logic it's performing? Yeah, mine.
Yeah, and there is in his as well.
Yeah, mine works exactly like that.
Sorry, I realised I was sounding patronising, but that was, well, because I was being patronising. No, but it's because this is kind of what I mentioned earlier, and we were kind of talking off camera, and I mentioned how one of the harder things to do is to get away from just following tutorials into writing your own code. And that's kind of an example of that. The code is doing what we told it to. Obviously, that's all it can do.
And it's all it'll ever do.
That is why the blue screen is there in the middle of it, because we haven't actually done anything yet in the game, in the playing game state. But the render method is empty. We're not actually drawing anything.
As is the update method. Well, the update method isn't, but it doesn't instantiate anything that's visible.
And actually now would probably be a good time to bring in that nasty pink colour.
Oh, no. My retina already got burned enough after playing with your project today.
Oh, there's only that little tiny crack that is kind of... I'm going to sulk.
And another person asking the same question. Why didn't you use a base class that contained the manager field and base constructor instead of putting that into each class, or was it just for the demo? Well, ask yourself a question. Do you personally think that the existence of a single field that's common between multiple classes warrants the concept of inheritance? Does the concept of inheritance cover reducing the amount of code in a particular class by a single line? Should you...
Because the thing is, you can end up... I mean, I kind of went through that thought process, which was, well, these are all basically splash screens. I went as far as making a splash screen state, implemented iGame state, that then my windscreen, the blah-de-blah, inherited from. The problem there is you end up writing actually more code.
Yeah, you have to do like if this, if that, and so on.
Yeah, and also you end up with, when you first initially, the problem then becomes distinguishing which one's what, and you end up chaining together constructors and it all becomes a mess, because you have to tell it what state it's going to defer to afterwards. And then of course that state, if it's one of them, needs to know what state it defers to afterwards. And all of a sudden you're having to put all of your flow logic into one line of code, and it turns into a horrible mess.
Yeah, I mean, and you see this with Ruby Well, I don't mean to single out Ruby developers, but I meant Rails developers.
Yes, you do.
No, I mean to single out, because I think Ruby's a very pleasant language. I just don't agree with some of the design decisions of the Rails framework. And one of the things about the Rails framework that everybody says is don't repeat yourself. So what they'll do is they'll be like, okay, well, I'm using an H1 on this page, and I'm using an H1 tag on this page, and I'm also using an H1 tag on this page. Well, I'm going to create a template called H1 tag, and then inside of it, I'm going to put a switch statement that says, open H1 tag. If on this page, do this. If on that page, do that. And then you might be thinking, well, on this page, I want there to be a P tag opening immediately after that H1 tag. Well, if on that page, open up a P tag. And then your templates, your HT...
Come back to us, Nelson.
Well, my point is that by the end of at the end of the day, because you tried so hard not to repeat yourself, you ended up with all of your code having conditional logic in it, or other kinds of logic to determine what you could have expressed with just code. Yeah, start screen is just like this. Okay. Is there anything in the render of playing game state? Nope. When we add the two new public texture 2D variables, should game manager object automatically get two new fields that need to be assigned to in Unity? Yes. By adding a public field on a mono behavior, those fields will automatically pop up in the inspector window of Unity. Michael, are they public? They must be public fields. Can you use autofact with Unity? You can. You can also use autofact with mono behaviors, but it takes a little bit of work.
That's getting something out of... If we can please restrict questions to things that are relevant to what we're specifically doing at the moment, because we are just reached the 3-hour mark. And
we're going to actually have to wrap up soon. That's why I'm kind of being more... I'm just waiting to get people to implement this stuff and see if they have questions. And I'm trying to just fill up the void with something useful instead of just pausing the video. So...
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be up for another few hours, but people seem to complain once the day 2 mark is reached in these videos. So,
all right, go ahead and hit 1 more minute if you're still working on it. Otherwise, I mean, at this point, we're pretty much going to be wrapping up here and talking about where we're going to go next week. And this has officially turned into a 7-week class now?
Will it be 9 if we're doing one extra? I thought these were all going to be 8 weeks.
No, I thought this one was a 6-week class. I mean, I should know.
Well, I've been setting up with 8 weeks of folders. Cause
said I should know.
I'm sure there was a discussion at some point where we just went, should we just make all these 8 weeks?
No, it's 6 weeks, so it'll be a 7-week class now.
Cool.
Okay, is the point of defining the textures in Game Manager CS to make the graphics linking in Unity easier with the empty object, rather than defining them each in a state.cs screen and creating a separate empty object for each? Yes, the reason that these are public fields is out of convenience. It's also it's just a lot easier to explain. I mean,
Shall I jump in and, seeing as I kind of, it's my fault that I decided to do it that way around instead of doing them in code. See, the thing is, you don't really, in prototyping things up, trying to get something put together, it's very, very convenient to be able to just drag and drop things around and via the inspector. And it's kind of a development paradigm I've started following in Unity, is that anything that I know is either going to be made in code later or is going to come from some other place in my model of things. It could be coming from a config file, it could be coming from anywhere. I will start off just chucking a public field on my game manager as a temporary, and I want to emphasize that before Nelson swims across the Atlantic and stabs me, as a temporary place to put information that is available globally.
yeah, and it does...
So that you can, because you do have the advantage then that you can press play and tweak stuff.
Well, exactly, and
These values won't necessarily be updated, and you do have to get kind of get used to when and it will and when it won't update values. But basically, it gives you the opportunity to play around inside of Unity's editor. Once you get to the point where you're actually starting to build things out, you should have got rid of most of those, unless you're making something that's got, I don't know, a level editor where, unless you're actually building for it to be a part of Unity and you're using Unity editor, all of those really should be in a relevant place, even if that place is essentially a globals. It's a holding zone like a config.ini. Did I get out of that? I thought I got out of that quite well.
No, it made sense. And I did want to ask for the benefit of instructing. It's also very easy to visualize. It's a lot easier to visualize than the alternatives, even if the alternatives have benefits to them.
Because and if we were doing this properly, even if going about it this way, you would be checking to make sure that they weren't null and that they had been set in the inspector, and you would give backups that, there's a lot more of that sort of craft that we are kind of skirting around by virtue of doing it this way, because this is a 101 course, and you're kind of, if you were to do things the right way from the start, we would need a 16-week course to get the same game done and explain why.
Can I see iGame Manager? Well, keep in mind, iGame Manager. Wait a sec, do I have an iGame Manager?
No, you just have Game Manager.
Yeah. Are you wanting a game manager or an iGame state? Okay. Yeah, the only modification I made to game manager was that I added these two public fields to it. Oh, you meant game state? What? Gavin, interpret. Oh, here's game state. Well, here, have both.
Put game manager and iGame state up, and then whichever one it was, yeah.
Okay.
Well, see, I'll come back to that, NATO, once we've finished the actual video. So,
I think we're just about...
Are you planning on just wrapping up with this?
Yeah, because just about everybody's ready. We'll be around after the video's wrapped up. I'm going to go ahead and jump back into Unity, though, and just point out that I did indeed associate these two textures. Again, that's just following through what we discussed before. And as a final thing, here's the game. So I can press any key to start. At this point, I now am in the game state. I can hit spacebar to lose the game. If I hit spacebar to lose the game, I go into the lose game state. I can hit any key, I go back to the main state. Now I can hit any key and hit enter, and I get the win state. So it's basically the best game ever made.
Well, this is the thing, because I'm guaranteed there's at least half a dozen people sat there going, oh, well, that's dull. Oh, well, I thought we were going to have, like, explosions happening and things flying around. Blah, blah, blah. This idea of the state machine that we've basically built here is applicable to so many things, in particularly game programming, but just coding in general. It is something that will be coming back. And if you can get your head around it as a principle, it'll be really, really, really handy for you going forward. Because it's all about those three words again: readability, flexibility, and maintainability.
Yep. Could I add the textures again? Yeah, all I did was I clicked and I drug. I had this open in the thingy, in the inspector. I clicked on a texture and I put it, just drag and dropped it. And that's it, really. Okay, unless anybody has, I mean, if you guys still have questions, feel free to stay after the video. If there are, yes, indeed, I drugged it.
In terms of homework this week, yes, I wasn't going to comment on that. You need to make sure that you've got as far as we have. If you've been following along during the video and everything works like it does, then you should be good.
Yep.
If you want to... Actually, I'm not going to say that because that will just cause confusion. So yes, basically, and this will generally go for the at least next few weeks. Homework will be to get what we've got done.
Yep. And as we add more extensibility points into this application, there will be additional pieces of homework for, we'll then create something new or do something like that. But at this point, it's just vital that for everybody following along with the course, that they have this code written.
Well, I will say, I'll give a caveat, and I will put this as officially being part of the homework. If you are a coder who's coming to Unity who's not familiar with Unity, go through the Unity fundamentals. If you are a designer type and who isn't used to coding, go through the C# 101. And if you're just generally new to all this, go through the Unity fundamentals and go through the C# 101. And that's a lot of videos, but pick out, just try and get your head around those things, because there is so much. I can't begin to express how difficult a balance it is to kind of get between the disparate groups of people who have taken this course.
Well, and we're about to wrap up at least the recording, but we did get one more question that I will address on the recording, saying, I talked about public fields being set everywhere and being manipulated by every man and his dog, bad obviously, and therefore hard to find where things are changed. Is the same true about anyone being able to change the state? First of all, when I was talking about public fields being able to be changed by anybody, I didn't actually say public fields, I said static properties. Static properties are very problematic because they allow you to change everything or be changed in places that aren't very coherent. Now, in the context of the game manager, we will be abusing the game manager a little bit. We will be using the game manager to store things in a way that may not be the most optimal for the purposes, of course, of getting this working. However, if you go through courses like the C# 102 and 103, you'll learn a bunch of strategies that you can employ to actually make sure that data is kept very well guarded. Now, the idea that you can change the current state to another state, that isn't about really changing things as much as it is about.
Well, that's how a state system works.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, we just happen to have used combined the game manager with the state system that's going on. But you fundamentally, the two things you need are the base type that they all are inheriting, or in this case implementing, but B, some method of changing from one state to the next state. Otherwise, it's not so much a state system as just a state. You need to be able to change from one state to another. Otherwise, you might as well just have a single class.
All right, so to all the future people following along, I guess we're going to be wrapping this up. Next week we'll be continuing on this, and we will start the class, and I'm actually a little bit happier now to have this as the start of the class for dealing with the background stuff, because that's going to...
Yeah, that's cool. It separates it.
Yeah, it's going to be a decent amount of work. So yeah, goodbye everyone, and see you later.
I want my hoverboard.